Welcome. In this video, we're going to look at the topic of event propagation. Event propagation in JavaScript deals with the three event phases: capturing, target, and bubbling. Whenever we have an event in JavaScript, we have access to the event phase property. This will give us one of three values. It will either give us the value of 1, meaning that we're in the capturing phase, 2, meaning that we're at the target phase, or the level of the object that actually had the event occur, or 3, we're in the bubbling phase. It could also return the value of 0, meaning that there is no event currently occurring. Let's take a look at this illustration for an example. Draw your attention to the dark blue TD element. Let's imagine that one of the table cells where it reads "over the river Charlie" was clicked. In JavaScript in the DOM, what's happening, although we don't know that this is necessarily going on behind the scenes, but every element above the TD is going to be notified during the capture phase. So starting at the window level, down to the document, the HTML, body, table, table body, TR, and then finally the TD will be notified that something beneath it has been clicked. All of this in red here is part of the capture phase. Finally, it gets to the target phase. This explains why in the past we've seen event.target or e.target representing the element that was actually clicked or had the event occur. Phase 2 represents this target phase of the element that actually had the event occur. Then there is a third phase, the bubbling phase, where every element above this in the DOM is again notified that this element had an event occur to it. So we see this three-phase event propagation take place behind the scenes anytime we have an event on an element in the DOM. The capture phase, where everything above this element is notified, the target phase, where we reach the actual element where the event occurred, and then the bubbling phase, where everything above it is notified again. Now, when we normally work with JavaScript, we may not see this happening. This is all happening behind the scenes, and it's pretty much instantaneous. However, if we attach event listeners to events above in the DOM where an event occurs, it is possible for them to listen in at the capture and or bubbling phase. Let's take a look at this in the code to see what it looks like in action. Okay, in this example, let's start with our HTML. We have our content div that we're used to, and then a new class container with 3 divs, each having a unique ID and the same number inside of it. So we see here we've got div 1, 2, and 3 that all have the class containers. That is our markup. Now in our JavaScript, we're grabbing all of these, get elements by class name. That's going to give us an array of all 3 of the containers. And then we're simply looping through them all and adding an event listener to each container. So what this function is going to be doing, this display event phase, is going to be logging out information on each one of these containers. Again, so this first part of the code here, all we're doing is we're adding the exact same listener onto each one of these containers, container 1, container 2, and container 3. Now let's look a bit more at this display event phase function. What we have going on is we're passing in the event object as the parameter e, and then we're assigning the event phase that we looked at before to a variable of phase. What this will allow us to do is we're going to say, okay, if the phase is equal to 1, then reassign phase to capturing. If it's equal to 2, then assign it to at target, and if 3, bubbling. So all this is doing is instead of having to look at numbers, we're going to be able to read what that phase is. So it's just to help things be a little bit more readable when we start logging out more information. This code does not necessarily need to be here. Again, it's just so that instead of looking at the numbers 1, 2, or 3, we could reassign this phase variable to be capturing at target or bubbling. Then down below, what we're going to do is we're going to log out box and then get the ID of the box. So as we saw before, each container has an ID assigned to it, and we could simply write this.id. This is a short code for writing get attribute ID. That would be the exact same thing. But this is just going to get the ID. We're going to put a dash and then write out the phase that we're in. So I'm going to come back to this object here a little bit later, but first let's just take a look at this code running right now. I'm going to go ahead and click on 1, and we could say, okay, box 1, we're at target. What does that mean? That means that box 1 is the event where this occurred. Let's refresh it and click on box 2. Now we could see, okay, we're at box 2 at target, and then it bubbles up and notifies box 1. Let's try this with box 3. What would you expect? We click on it, we get box 3 at target, bubbling up to box 2, and then bubbling up to box 1. Now let me draw your attention back up here. This last parameter that we didn't really look at in depth before, we kind of just glossed over it and said that we'd come back to it later. What this last parameter of add event listener is it's a parameter of whether we want to use the capture phase or the bubbling phase. Although it's technically just saying use capture. In this case, we've set it to false. So what are we seeing? We're seeing the bubbling phase happen here. If I come back to this example here, we could see that the bubbling phase takes place after the target phase. So what this is saying when we set this parameter to false is we're saying if you're going to notify things, do it after the target phase. So that's why when we click on box 3 in the middle, we see it hit the target and then bubble up. So let's swap these out. Let's go ahead, and this line here does the exact same thing. Just notice now it's saying use the capture phase. Let's go through the same practice. I'm going to click box 1. Notice, okay, we're just at target right away. Click on box 2. Now we see we hit box 1 first and then box 2. What's going to happen with box 3? You guessed it. It's going to hit box 1, box 2, and then box 3. Now, let's add both of these. So what are we doing now? Now we're saying, actually we'll switch them here, just so the order makes a little bit more sense. So what we're going to say is, all right, use display event phase, but use it in the capturing phase. And then we're going to say display event phase the same way, but this time use the bubbling phase. So now if we click on 1, we're going to see, okay, we're at target and this happens twice. Now when we click on box 2, we see, okay, the capturing phase happens first, it hits at target again because this is running the same code, and then it's going to bubble back up. Now if we hit 3, what's going to happen? We're going to get the capturing at target, and then it's going to bubble back up. So with these two event listeners, we're showing how you could get everything notified during the capturing phase or bubbling phase. Now it's worth pausing to say, why would you need to do this? Why would you attach an event listener to all objects and be notified in parent objects when something in a child occurs? Now, I don't have a hard example for you here, but I will say there will be times as you start developing where you're going to wonder, okay, I want to have a child element clicked, but I want the parent to know what's going on inside of the child. This is when attaching an event listener to both the parent and the child can be helpful. The next question will come up is, do I want the parent to be notified before the child event occurs or after? So in the case of, let's say that we wanted our parent element to do something and then the child element to do something else, which would we use? We would use the capturing phase because this element 1 is going to be notified before it gets to element 3. However, if we want the parent to do something after the event occurs in element 3, then we would use the bubbling phase. This is a little bit theoretical, and it's something you probably won't need to use until you get much more in depth into JavaScript, and you may find that you don't ever really need to use it. But you do need to understand the concept because you will hear it addressed. And when we're working with add event listeners, it's important we know what true or false does as the last parameter of whether to use the capture phase. So now that we've taken a look at that, I want to come back to this ID. In the past, what we've done is use the e.target. So this is something really important to stress here. There is a difference between e.target and this .id. So let me actually comment this back out, and I'm going to show you something. So what am I doing now? Now I'm going to write the same code twice, except instead of saying this, I'm going to do e.target. And watch what happens when I run this. We actually don't need both of these going. I'm just going to comment out one of them. And I'll click on 3 here. Notice what happens. It says box 1 capturing, box 3 capturing, box 2 capturing, box 3 capturing, box 3 at target, box 3 at target. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that eTarget, which is the second one to appear, is going to be every single time which element was the target element, or which element had the phase of target applied to it. However, this is going to be whatever element is currently being triggered with this add event listener. Now, this concept of this and the concept of scope is something that we're going to look at more in depth a little bit later in this course. So if this doesn't make complete sense right now, that's okay. However, it is important to point out that what this is referring to is the original element that the event listener was attached to. So when we have an event listener attached to every element, it's going to be triggered every time. So when I click on 3, element 1 will be triggered, element 2, and then element 3. The this would refer to the element 1, element 2, and then element 3. However, every single time, even if we're in element 1, eTarget is going to refer to element 3 because that's the event that was actually clicked in this case. The this is just getting notified due to the bubbling or capturing phase and the way that event propagation works. So let me remove this code, and I'll put this little bit uncommented. So what is this saying here? This is saying if the event target ID is equal to this ID, and what that means is, okay, if this event that has been triggered, or this element that has been triggered, is the same one as the element on which the event occurred, then go ahead and display this line here. So let me change actually this message. Then I'm going to click it. Okay, so notice that the last time we saw that e.target is actually equal to this, but in the other ones, this was not equal to target. In position 1, 1, and 2, this was not where the target was happening. Now if we change it and we click on 2, notice that now when it gets to 2, it triggers we're here. Again, this may be a little bit confusing, this may not make complete sense, but it is super important to know, and just remember in the back of your mind that when you have this inside of an event listener by default, what it's going to usually refer to is the element that was clicked on. Now this may change and shift, and we'll get further in depth into this later, but in this case, it's just helpful to know, okay, if I want to do something in a parent element when a child element is clicked, I can't use e.target like we have in the past. We have to use this. All right, so this is just something to point out, put in the back of your mind, and then remember for later, and we'll come back into this in more depth later in this course. So now let's look at another important concept, and that is that in addition to this capturing phase and bubbling phase, we also have the ability to stop propagation. So with this parameter here, we could say, okay, we want parent elements to be referred to or notified on the capturing phase, or in this one here, on the bubbling phase, but we could also stop propagation from occurring completely and have no parent elements notified. The way we do this is with the stop propagation method. What this will do is no matter what we've set on our add event listener, whether to notify parents on the capturing or bubbling phase, this will stop propagation from occurring completely. So let's go back and look at the example we were working with before, but this time adding in stop propagation. Okay, so here we have something very similar to before. Notice I've removed one of the add event listeners, and I don't have the extra e.target code down below here. We're just working with this, and we're just working with one. So let's just click on this again to see what happens. Notice that if we have this set to false, everything else is going to be notified on the bubbling phase. If I set it to true, then everything will be notified in the capturing phase. So that's just as we would expect. But look down here at this line, and let's comment out this. What we're doing here is we're saying event, or E. We could call this event. We're going to use a shortcode E, and in the next video, I'll get more into that later. The event object itself we'll look at in more depth. But for now, we just want to look at stop propagation. So now what happens when we click on this is simply box 1 is notified. You could see, for example, that box 2 is never gotten to, and neither is box 3. So when would we use something like this? In this case, we're saying notify in capturing phase. So that means that the highest element that happens here, in this case the parent one, is notified, but then nothing else happens because this stops the propagation from occurring any further. Now if we were to change this to false and notify all parent elements in the bubbling phase, kind of the opposite occurs. Now if we click on box 3 is notified, but none of the parent. So it depends how we're using this. If we use it during the capturing, it's going to say, okay, even though we click on 3 here, it stops after the highest element with an event listener has this running. And then if we switch it, we could see, okay, nothing above it happens. So one of the cases of this would be if you have multiple event listeners on something and you do not want the parents to be notified, you would use false here, and then you could stop the propagation from bubbling back up to notify the parents. On the flip side, if you just wanted the parent to know, but you didn't care what was going on in the child element, you only wanted to notify the parent, then you could set this to true and stop propagation from happening on anything lower. So again, at this point, we don't have a bunch of concrete examples of when you might need to know this. It's just going to be something that you have to store away to remember that, okay, this process occurs. We have event propagation where we could have parent elements notified either during a capturing phase or during a propagating, and we have the ability with stop propagation to stop that from happening. So that pretty much covers everything we're going to go over at this point in terms of event propagation. So let's just take a moment to review what we've learned so far. First of all, we learned that there are 3 event phases: capturing, target, and bubbling, although it is also possible for event phase to return 0, meaning there's no events. But really, it's the capturing, target, and bubbling phases that you want to understand what they are and how they work. We also returned back to the event listeners and saw that we have a use capture parameter that we'd been setting to false before, but now we understand what happens when we set it to true and what happens when we set it to false. I also want to make a note that if you use remove event listeners, you have to make sure that the use capture parameter is also the same. We also looked a bit at event target versus this. So in this case, this is going to refer to whatever element is currently being triggered during the capturing or bubbling phase. However, event target is always going to refer to the element on which the event happened. When you get to the target phase, or phase 2, these two are going to be equal, but during the capturing and bubbling phases, these two will not be equal. Again, this may not make full sense to you at this point, or it may not sink in completely yet, but we'll come back to this and scope later on, and that'll help explain things a little bit more. But it is important to remember that if you're using an event listener on a parent element and you're trying to figure out and work with it, you can't use event.target, you'd have to use this in this case. The other thing that we learned is that you can stop propagation with event.stopPropagation. Now, if you're using this during the capturing phase, it means that only the top level parent element will be notified and then nothing below it. Or if you use it during the bubbling phase, it means that only the target element is notified and then nothing above it receives that notification. Lastly, I want to say this is something you should definitely practice. Look at the source code in the example files, but then go try to reproduce this yourself without looking. Try to create this nested hierarchy of things and try to notify and run different code or even the same code when parent elements are clicked or when a child element is clicked, get the parent to receive that notification. It's very important that you understand how capturing and bubbling work. Even if you're not going to be using it day to day with your programming, especially early on, it is important that you understand this concept. So definitely take the time to practice this. Once you have had a chance to do that, we're going to come back and we're getting towards the end of our in-depth look at events here, and we're finally going to go in-depth now on the event object. We've learned a lot about different properties and methods of the event object so far, but now we really have enough understanding to go in-depth and look at the event object itself.